In most of the world, distrusting the government is so normalized that trusting it reads as naive. Cynicism about public institutions is treated as political sophistication, as evidence that a person understands how things actually work rather than how they are supposed to work. In Nordic countries, the opposite is true. A Norwegian who expresses deep suspicion of public institutions is not a realist. They are the unusual one. The person in the room whose relationship with the systems around them reads as slightly paranoid rather than appropriately cautious. This video is about what it actually feels like to live inside that inversion. And before we get into it, I want to flag something for people who stick around until the end. Because there is a specific implication of living in a high-trust society like the Nordic ones that most people, when they first encounter it, find actually uncomfortable. It is not what you expect, and it is worth hearing. Before we continue, if you'd consider subscribing, it only takes a few seconds and helps the channel out a lot. Now, let's get into it. Start with something concrete, because the abstract claim that Nordic people trust their government means very little until it is attached to specific daily experiences that make the trust visible. In Norway, when your tax return is due, the government has already filled it in. Your income, your deductions, your liability, calculated and submitted by the tax authority on your behalf. You review it, confirm it is correct, and that is the end of the transaction. There is no industry of tax preparers, no anxiety about whether you are doing it right, no fear of penalties for errors in a process you do not fully understand. The government did the paperwork, you confirmed it, done. Another important part of their trust is this. When a Nordic person gets sick, money is not a variable in the decision-making process. Not in the background, not as a quiet anxiety, not as a calculation about whether this particular symptom is serious enough to justify the cost of finding out. The healthcare system exists, it is funded, and the person's relationship with it is simply to use it when it is needed. The specific mental freedom this produces, the complete absence of the specific category of anxiety that medical costs generate in systems where they are a real variable, is difficult to describe to someone who has never lived without it. It is not gratitude, because gratitude implies the thing could have been otherwise. It is simply the absence of a problem that, in other systems, is a constant background presence. Next is also a really important and often overlooked one. The child goes to school. The parent does not research the school extensively before choosing it, does not worry about whether this particular school, in this particular neighborhood, is going to give their child the opportunities that school quality determines, in more unequal systems. The school is a good school, because the schools are good schools, because the funding is distributed rather than concentrated, because the teachers are well-trained and reasonably paid and respected professionally, in a way that the research on educational outcomes consistently identifies as the primary driver of school quality. The Nordic parents' relationship with the school their child attends is simply that it is the school, and it will be fine, because the experience of people around them confirms that it will be fine. There is one more daily experience worth adding to this list before moving to where the trust comes from, because it is the one that produces the strongest reaction in people encountering the Nordic version of it for the first time. The pension. A Nordic worker in their 30s does not think about their pension, not because they are financially irresponsible, but because the pension exists, is funded collectively, and will be there. The specific anxiety that in many other countries accompanies the question of retirement savings, the awareness that individual investment decisions made in your 30s and 40s will determine the quality of your life in your 70s, the fear that you are not saving enough or investing correctly, or that the market will do something catastrophic at the wrong moment, simply does not exist in the same form. The retirement is handled, not by you individually, making potentially consequential decisions in a domain requiring financial expertise most people do not have, but by the collective system you contribute to, and that will deliver on its commitment when the time comes. These are not small things. They are, in aggregate, the description of a life from which an entire category of background anxiety has been removed. The anxiety about whether the system is working for you or against you, whether the institution you are dealing with is going to treat you fairly or find a way to disadvantage you, whether the rules that are supposed to protect you are actually going to be applied in your favor when you need them to be. Most people in most countries carry this anxiety so continuously that they have stopped experiencing it as anxiety. It is simply the background condition of navigating institutional life. Nordic people do not carry it, and the specific cognitive and emotional resource that is freed up by its absence is available for other things. Where does the trust come from? This is the question that most discussions of Nordic high-trust societies eventually arrive at, and the answer is more historically specific than it might seem. Nordic trust in institutions is not a cultural personality trait that Scandinavians were born with. It is the accumulated product of generations of institutions that earned trust through consistent performance, and of a political culture that maintained the expectation that institutions should perform consistently, rather than treating institutional failure as the normal state of affairs that individual citizens must simply navigate around. The historical roots run through the Lutheran tradition of civic obligation. The small and relatively homogeneous communities of the pre-industrial Nordic countries where institutions were built by and for the people immediately around them, and the specific political choices of the 20th century that produced the welfare state as a collective agreement rather than as a government program imposed on a skeptical population. The Nordic welfare state was not built against the wishes of the people it serves. It was built as an expression of a social contract that the population understood themselves to be parties to. The tax rate is high, the services are good. The connection between the two is direct and visible. That visibility is itself a trust-maintaining mechanism. When people can see what their contributions produce, the contribution feels less like extraction and more like investment. The transparency of Nordic public institutions is worth naming specifically because it is one of the most concrete mechanisms through which the trust is maintained, rather than simply assumed. In Norway, every civil servant's salary is publicly available. Every government decision is documented and accessible. The oil fund's holdings are published in full annually. Denmark and Finland consistently top global corruption perception indices, not because their officials are more virtuous by nature, but because the systemic transparency that makes corruption difficult to sustain has been built into the institutional architecture. Trust that is maintained through transparency is different from trust that is maintained through faith. It is verifiable, and the verification confirms rather than undermines it. The research on what institutional trust does to individual well-being confirms what the daily experience of Nordic people describes. The OECD's well-being research has found that institutional trust is one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction across countries. More predictive than income above a certain threshold. More predictive than many of the factors that people in low-trust societies invest heavily in, as substitutes for the trust they cannot access. The person in a high-trust society who does not spend cognitive resources monitoring for institutional betrayal has those resources available for the actual content of their life. The research cannot easily measure this freed capacity directly, but it shows up consistently in the higher scores that high-trust populations report on measures of relaxation, freedom from worry, and the sense that life is going as it should. What does the trust feel like from the inside? This is the Channel B question, the one that requires describing an experience rather than documenting a phenomenon. The closest approximation, for someone who has not lived inside a high-trust society, is the specific feeling of walking into a building where you know the rules are fair and will be applied fairly, as opposed to a building where you are not sure whether the rules favor you or disadvantage you, and where you arrive already preparing for the possibility of being treated unfairly. Most people have had both experiences in specific contexts. The Nordic experience is that the second feeling, the defensive preparation for institutional unfairness, is simply not the default mode of engaging with public systems. You arrive expecting it to work because it usually works, and because it usually works, the expectation is confirmed. And because the expectation is confirmed, the trust is maintained. There is a specific social texture that high institutional trust produces in daily interactions between people that is worth describing separately from the experience of dealing with institutions directly. When people in a society broadly trust the systems around them, they also tend to trust each other more, because the systems provide a framework of accountability that reduces the specific risks that make interpersonal distrust rational. A Nordic person who leaves their bicycle unlocked outside a cafe is not being naive. They are operating in an environment where the combination of social norms, low inequality, and effective law enforcement makes the theft less likely than it would be in an environment where those conditions do not exist. The trust in institutions and the trust in people around you are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon expressed at different scales, and they reinforce each other in ways that make the high-trust society more self-sustaining than it might appear from outside. The honest complications matter here, and skipping them would make this video dishonest. Nordic trust in institutions is not absolute, is not uniformly distributed across the population, and is not without basis for critique. Sweden's handling of COVID produced real controversy and a government inquiry that found significant failures. Denmark's immigration policies have been the subject of intense domestic debate about whether the social contract extends equally to everyone within Nordic borders. Norway's oil fund has faced questions about the consistency between its ethical investment mandate and its continued extraction of the resource that funds it. Nordic citizens critique their institutions. The trust is not faith. It is a conditional assessment that the systems are performing well enough to deserve continued confidence, and that assessment is subject to revision when the evidence warrants it. The trust also varies within Nordic populations. Immigrants to Nordic countries, particularly those who arrived as refugees, and whose initial experience of Nordic institutions was as the object of bureaucratic processing, rather than as a citizen engaging with systems that serve them, tend to report lower institutional trust than native-born Nordics. The social contract that produces the high-trust society is one that Nordic citizens are born into and experience continuously from birth. The experience of arriving from outside it, and of navigating the specific bureaucratic processes that immigration involves in any country, is a different experience from the one this video has been describing, and it would be inaccurate to suggest otherwise. Now for the specific implication that was flagged at the beginning of this video, the one that most people find uncomfortable when they first encounter it. A high-trust society requires something from its citizens in return for the trust it makes possible. It requires compliance. Not blind compliance, not the suppression of critique, but the specific willingness to contribute to systems you may not personally benefit from in every transaction. To pay taxes that fund services you do not currently use. To support institutions that serve others as well as you. The Nordic social contract is not a transaction in which each citizen receives exactly what they contribute. It is a collective arrangement in which the aggregate contributions of everyone produce conditions that are better for everyone than any individual could produce for themselves. The implication of this is specific and worth sitting with. The high-trust society is only possible among people who are willing to trust each other, as well as the government. The government trust is downstream of the social trust, and the social trust requires, at its foundation, a willingness to participate in collective arrangements, whose benefits you may not fully see and may not fully receive. The Norwegian who trusts the government is not less politically aware than someone who does not. They are not naive about power, or about institutional failure, or about the history of governments that did not deserve the trust placed in them. They are the beneficiary of generations of institutions that earned trust through consistent performance, and of a culture that maintained the expectation that they should. And they are the participant in a social contract that asks something of them in return. The willingness to contribute to something larger than their individual interests, on the premise that everyone else is doing the same. The question is not whether Nordic institutions are perfect. They are not. The question is whether the specific quality of daily life that high institutional trust produces, the absence of the background anxiety, the freedom to simply use the systems rather than navigate around them, is worth the specific demands that maintaining such a society places on everyone inside it. Nordic people, generation after generation, have answered yes. All the sources and data referenced in this video are listed in the description below. Sit with that for a moment. I'll see you in the next one.